struck by the last panel. So mass incarceration has emerged in context of concentrated poverty and a whole array of social problems that grow up in environments of concentrated poverty. The answer to that challenging set of social conditions in Bill's work was a reinvigorated social policy that was addressing the employment problems of men with very low levels of schooling in inner city communities and supports for children and families. It's very hard for me to see how we can sustainably retreat from mass incarceration simply by shrinking prisons and not addressing the social problems that are associated with concentrated poverty. It's hard for me to see how a different kind of justice can't also have at its centre a reinvigorated social policy of the kind that the bill was describing, particularly in the truly disadvantaged. And I think the criminal justice community hasn't really caught up to that reality yet. It's a very narrow discussion about changes, chiefly in sentencing. And I think Bill's analysis invites us to take in the whole social context of the communities in which mass incarceration has unfolded. So that's my kickoff.
Just one follow-up. In a world, if we don't do the kind of social investment that you're talking about and that Bill talked about, then release from prison, as you wrote about in homework, will only replicate the same patterns. I said if we don't do the kind of social investment that you are talking about, then the post-release world will look exactly like the pre-release world. And then it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see, this didn't work.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so the antidote, I think, is as much a social justice project as a criminal justice project. It's about reintegrating people into society, surely, after prison, but also restoring community membership in a much deeper way. And that's the role of social policy.
So, turning now to Khalil, now with the microphone on. The question, each of these participants asked me to ask them questions, which I will riff on a little bit. Criminal justice had not, in the past, considered the work of academic historians. What changed, and why is it that the kinds of history, how can history help us understand criminal justice issues, particularly history of slavery, history of disinvestment, post-Reconstruction? How does this help us understand the kinds of problems that Bruce was talking about?
I asked you to ask that question, but then I'm thinking, I don't really know the answer to that.
There you go. Okay. No, you should say beats me.
Especially the what changed question. I'm like, why did I ask myself that question? I think because it's a good question to ask, what changed. So let me respond quickly to something Bruce just said, because I think it's going to be a hanging chad in my head, and I just want to get it out. And that is that one of the things that history and historians have shown, and other work is continuing to show, is that if we were to decarcerate at a significant level, then we would remove the criminogenic and violent features of the state itself in creating conditions of violence in communities, in which case I don't think things would simply return to the way they were. We see in lots of countries around the world interpersonal violence and community violence that is not exacerbated or even caused by the state's punitive regime in and of itself. in which case those cases of violence often are lower, not simply because of the lack of guns in those communities, but simply because the community ethos and the social ecology of those communities find other means for conflict resolution, of which the state itself is not playing a first-order role. So I just was thinking about that's going to cloud everything else. So one of the great things about spending a lot of time with Bruce, even though he abandoned me here as well,
there you go.
Is that he has invited me on a couple of occasions to think deeply about what historians do and can offer to this conversation. And so maybe the what changed conversation is that Bruce decided that historians should have a seat at some of these tables. And so in that way, I'm grateful. And others like Heather Thompson have joined in that conversation, and Harvard's Liz Hinton. And so the community of historians that are part of these conversations, I think, is growing. So I want to set a kind of big historical frame. I also want to riff a little bit on the things that Orlando talked about yesterday with regard to historical development and comparative approaches. And I also want to acknowledge that although I was not a student of Professor Wilson's, his work influenced my dissertation writing at the time. As a historian, I was trying to essentially capture the historical forces without the work of Bill defining the terms that people were defining criminology and criminality in the moment. So I read, for me, the first book was When Work Disappears in 1996, when in fact I was a first dissertator, and then moved my way backwards. So I want to acknowledge the influence he's had on my work as well. So that being said, I'm going to read something that is pat, and therefore I won't ramble, but it's a big claim about history. And so Bruce has already given us a context of statistics, and so I'll simply pick up there with the United States is the most punitive country in the world by population, by per capita rates, and by expenditures. The United States exceeds all other nations in how many of its citizens, asylum seekers, and undocumented immigrants are under some form of criminal justice supervision. Over the past 2 decades, there's been an explosion of reports by government agencies, nonprofits, and international advocacy organizations exploring the dimensions of what is unquestionably a peculiar form of American exceptionalism. While empirical and comparative data on the size and scope of the American system and its many clients will continue to lie at the heart of many of these reports, only within the past decade has research on the historical roots of American punitiveness gained increasing attention. Why is the United States so punitive? May be the most relevant question to answer, but it is also among the most difficult. The challenge is not the lack of historical drivers or causes or even the range of possible philosophical explanations for how Americans have imagined crime, sin, human nature, and the utility of punishment going back to the Enlightenment period. The problem is that historical and philosophical explanations have been the least credible or authoritative in explaining mass incarceration among policymakers. Empirical researchers and criminal justice practitioners have generally set aside history in exchange for behavioral models and methodologies that focus mostly on crime itself as the most measurable and verifiable driver of of American punitiveness. There are innumerable legal and political questions that have arisen out of these approaches. Everything from the social construction of illegality to the politicization of punishment to the stigmatization of physical identities and social status have long called into question the legal structures that underpin what counts as crime and how punishment is distributed. And yet, until quite recently, the question of what history has to offer has mostly been considered by historians, historically minded social scientists, critical race and ethnic studies scholars, community and prison-based activists, investigative journalists, and civil and human rights advocates. The disconnect is striking between the primary knowledge producers of criminal justice data interpretation and everyone else. One of the legacies of the federal explosion in criminal legislation and crime control spending in the 1960s was the gradual collapsing of academic research into technocratic-based and practitioner-centric research communities. To put it simply, over the last 50 years, empirical researchers focused on the needs and interests of law enforcement and corrections officials and vice versa, limiting the impact of other forms of knowledge. The fact that historically informed research has often buttressed critiques of and political resistance to police, prisons, and the courts demonstrates just how fraught the politics of knowledge itself has been. This raises a first-order problem in any effort to use history to reimagine how to make America less punitive today. To what extent can the targets of reform, practitioners and policymakers, be moved by the past if they think it is immaterial to the present? What imaginary line do people draw in the chronological sands of time that makes history ancient or irrelevant to them, no matter how compelling the historical evidence is? Without taking into account how often history is discounted in policy circles, much of what proceeds in this paper may not matter much to those whose need of understanding the past is actually greatest. This may be the biggest challenge than the simple recovery and teaching of these founding historical problems of our punitive nation. And that's a shout out to Orlando himself, calling our attention at the beginning of this symposium about the lack of attention to historical development and comparative dimensions. I also just want to shout out, I think that, and this is not a breakthrough, but I think it is a breakthrough with regard to roads not traveled. So let me offer one vision of where sociology itself, it has been less willing to adapt and absorb the full historical method. And this is to come back to Dubois, as Orlando suggested earlier. So in looking at Bill's early work, I looked for Dubois, and the great wonders of going back to original work is keyword searching today. And so Dubois is there. But like so much of sociology and so much of the canonical way in which we've reinforced the relationship of social forces to individual and cultural predispositions, or the range of behavioral approaches that people take given the social forces bearing down on them, Dubois is light. I would call Bill's early work light on Dubois in that sense. And so one of the things I want to point to is both Dubois's early critique of empiricism itself. I want to point to Dubois's general theory of whiteness, which I would argue in some ways may be the least explored aspect of what we've talked about here. Theda has mentioned it in many dimensions, and may be the one person in the room who's talked extensively about it. But maybe the most provocative thing I could say, and building on Dubois's general theory of whiteness, which certainly informed an entire school of whiteness studies among historians and cultural studies writers, people associated more likely with critical ethnic studies, et cetera, is that Dubois clearly left scientism from the late 1890s to the moment of becoming an activist with a full and unflinching appreciation that science by itself could not overcome the ethnocentrism of white people and their willingness to engage in tremendous contradictions and double standards to protect their own interests. In which case, how we understand social forces themselves are mitigated by the fact that whiteness as an identity construct, we have almost singularly talked about race in terms of non-white people. But Du Bois argued and asked us to consider that white people were not born with an identity, but were in fact making one for themselves, and particularly in the moment of the postbellum period. As such, and I'll stop here since this is just an opening question, one identity formation that came with that was the notion of whiteness as non-criminal. And so we have assumed within the context of social science that because we can measure behavior, that slapping the label of criminality was an objective, race-neutral act. But in fact, it has never been. The definition of crime has always been subject to political choices. And therefore, even social science, by not paying attention to historical development, missed the fact that its own imagination was truncated by how the assumptions that it made of what was in fact a fact, or what was truly empirical, or what was in fact a function of political dynamics that were very much in play. So that, I'll stop.
I'm going to repeat what Skip was saying.
And inscribed in the 13th Amendment.
Yes.
Yeah. that the very notion of freedom, but for crime, was a way of coercing, or, one simple thing, since Skip opened it up, is that labor market forces themselves, so we think of these things as detached, or things that we can actually move. But the criminal justice system has been a primary instrument of defining and shaping labor markets. Certainly since the end of slavery, but all the way up to today. The simplest example would be credit ratings. Credit ratings are today determined in part by the crime rates of the communities that you happen to live in. Therefore, your own presence in a community attached to your attempt to get access to credit puts you at a disadvantage, higher rates, which is part of essentially the tax that poor backed or disadvantaged people have been playing. The criminal justice system, and there's much more to say about that role as well.
Do you want to add something, Bruce? I mean,
Mike.
Mike, you're Mike.
Yeah, I'm trying to work out whether. I agree so substantially with Khalil. I'm trying to work out whether to pick an argument with him on the role of social policy in an alternative, a reimagined kind of criminal justice. And I take your point that simply shrinking the system is not necessarily an invitation to violence in disadvantaged communities. That I don't agree with that at all. But I think if we are to have a positive conception of what justice could be and the role of public policy in achieving that in disadvantaged communities, I think that is where social policy, building pathways of opportunity to the mainstream structure of advantages in American society, social policy has to be an indispensable component of that positive vision of justice. That's my only point.
We agree completely, and I didn't need to make the impression that it was an either or. It's a both, and I just wanted to suggest that we, in the process of getting to social policy, which is, we just saw from the last panel, the uphill slog that we have, we can start with decarceration.
Right,
Yeah.
and I also think, isn't there a temporal dimension, a short-term, long-term issue, which is the impact of decarceration will not build the kind of communities you're talking about immediately. And so the question is, how do you deal with the social policy and the investment issues, at least both in the short term and long term, but there are short-term issues, which we will see in the United States with even the limited numbers of people who are now being released, which segues right into Philip's question, which I can't find, but your question, which had to do with the relationship between Bill's work and the policing work that you do, the social structures and how they relate to your work on patterns of policing.
So thank you. I think that my question was, since it is canon in employment, in talking about education, in housing, that we understand that structures produce culture and that then that becomes a reciprocal relationship. Why do we know so very little about the structures that produce the kind of policing that all of us are all too familiar with since 2014, and many of us since we were born in those kinds of communities? And I think there is actually a fairly straightforward answer to that. I sent the question to you because one of my students asked me. So we work in the area. So in addition to being a professor, which is, I guess, my day job, my side hustle, from the people from Philadelphia who know what that is I run a nonprofit center called the Center for Policing Equity. And we work inside of police departments to make them less racist and less deadly. It's a growth industry of the saddest kind. So one of my students, I was preparing to come here, rereading my very well dog-eared copy of When Work Disappears. One of my students came in and said, why in the year of our Lord, 2019, do we know so very, very little about how policing is structured and how the structures of policing produce certain community outcomes? And in my very best annoyed because you didn't make an appointment professorial voice, I said, because Bill Wilson was busy doing other things. And I think that was not just me being annoyed, at least I tell myself that, but it's also a reflection of some profound truths about what there is to be discovered and why we know so very little about it. So in trying to describe for students, to summarize the lyric tomes of scholarship produced by this man in front of me, I start with two insights. The first, which is canon among those folks who imagine themselves to be constructing a set of tools for both analysis and intervention into vulnerable communities, which is that there is humanity to be found and honored in hidden places. Okay. Now, I didn't realize we were going to go to church, but since you go ahead and read a sermon, I'll be not in but of the black church throughout this. So I'm not gonna, you don't have to say amen, but some of you may grunt appreciably back at me so we can do a little call and response. But what I mean by that is it is often very difficult to get access to a kind of data on people who have been forgotten and tossed away by a society. And Bill's work began to do that in a way that hadn't been done before. It's an age-old question. Well, they're there because they choose to be. Right? It's a culture that produces that, literally a culture of poverty. Right? So, but no, it's structures. No, it's culture. No, it's structures. And then you're between Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny, between rabbit season and duck season. And that's not a useful conversation. But there are ways you can ask that question that don't just shed light on the intellectual exercise of it, but on the humanity of the people in the hidden places. We have not bothered to look is part of the reason why we don't know more about the way that structures of policing produce cultures within communities. And let me tell you, as someone who has lived both in black housing projects and in suburban America, that's the structure for that ass. Okay, the structures of policing, they matter a great deal in producing the cultures that we walk around with. But the other insight that I think Bill's work leaves with us, at least front of mind for me, that I try and give to the students, is that not only is culture insufficient to explain racial stratification, but so too bigotry is insufficient to explain racial stratification. You can't get there. You can't explain it if all you've got is racists are going to racist, right? That is an insufficient mechanistic explanation. Now, I got to say, in policing, it is so very, very tempting to ignore that insight. If we think about the most viciously racist organization in the history of this country, think about what are the most viciously racist laws. Now, whose job was it to enforce them? It's law enforcement. When the laws are the law enforcement, you get what I'm doing, right? It's very straightforward that if we imagine that the problem is bigotry, even in part, that the most iconic images of that bigotry will be those who enforce the laws. Now, we were told not to tell stories, right? I don't work here. So let me illustrate. Motion allowed? Okay, I got permission from the judge. So let me illustrate just a little bit of what this meant from a scholarly perspective from the people doing the scholarship. I have the rare privilege of being, I think, the only psychologist on a panel up here for the day and a half, and one of the few who was an undergraduate student of Bill's. Now, when I first got here, it was the dawning of the dream team, right? So it's the big picture with everybody in profile looking slightly askance and up towards the horizon of a great black freedom movement that was going to happen here. And I have to say that I had two of my idols as professors. My intro to African American Studies was with the great Gap Tooth of Cornell West. And I was the personal assistant of the good Dr. Henry Louis Gates for exactly 3 weeks. Greatest, proudest 3 weeks of my undergraduate life. And I was walking up to and then into those very rickety elevators in, 1819 Church Street, before the Baker Center had opened, 1814 Church Street? Mass Ave, 18, but right around the corner from where the movie theater used to be and where African American Studies was and the Dubois Institute was as it was just getting started. And as I was riding up with the elevator, I was absorbing wisdom, right, from Cornell West, who had a great deal of wisdom to give. And I was excited to be doing that. And as we got off the elevator, I saw this man, the most excited I have ever seen him before, saw Cornell get out and said, "We got him! We got him!" And I didn't realize what that was about. I thought that was a strange encounter of two men to join together and embrace and jump, one jumping higher than the other, but still, a great deal of excitement. And when they turned and they said, "We got William Julius Wilson," I said, "The guy who wrote The Declining Significance of Race? I thought he wasn't one of us." No, I thought that, no. Yep. I'm telling a story, y'all. Keep up.
That's why you lasted 3 weeks.
3 weeks. Because I had been told that title meant what it didn't mean, right? That we were going to lose when towering black intellectuals started talking about things other than racism, that we would lose the moral authority that came with that argument. And again, you understand, Cornel West was, this is back when I had hair and could see my waist. It was a long time ago. Cornel West was my idol, my intellectual hero, amongst others. And when I said, well, I thought he wasn't one of us, he looked at me with the most withering uncle stare I had ever seen and said, "You haven't actually read it then." And what are the consequences to a young person, think this is before wokeness was a thing, right? To a young person who imagines that political identity is wrapped up in a particular kind of ideological entrenchment, right? That bigotry is the most powerful moral argument that one can muster. And then is told, in fact, you need to narrow that, right, your idea about what that can fix, and then expand the toolkit for things other than bigotry, right? Not just race-specific, not just targeted, but universal as well. Kind of a kind of policy credit for in the gaps when targeted policies aren't going to work or not going to be politically popular. I can tell you that in the world of policing, which is too much talked about and too little done about, that we are still in the same stage of intellectual development as myself before I got off that elevator. That we are still talking about policing and studying policing, either just as a way to regulate crime, where crime is the only outcome, and all of those hidden people, because the data are not there. There are no federal level data on police behavior. Forget about deadly force. I'm talking about just use of force. The FBI's got a database. This is being live streamed, right? So come on, y'all. You know better. The FBI's got a database, but the data won't be public. It'll be in reports that'll be put out in a cadence that nobody knows, right? We have no national level data on police behavior, stops, arrests, citations. We've got nothing. So we are talking about hidden places. But even more than that, people are invested in an ideological argument which is ill-fitting to the problem. So now I'm going to tell you a different story, which is not directly about Bill, but is the result of his influence on my thinking. So we got asked to go to Vegas to do work with a police department. Okay? Anybody gets a chance to go to Vegas with a police escort? Go ahead. That's a great gig. So we went there, and in Las Vegas, this is before 2016, so we had a democracy. They were concerned about the idea that they were going to get sued by local forces because they were using force too much, too often. They said, and the implication is we're using force too often on black and brown folks. Can you help us, Dr. Blackenstein? I said, well, give me the data. I'll take a look. And we had to go through by paper. So going through sheet by sheet by sheet, a lot of use of forces, had a foot pursuit immediately proceeding. Right? So a foot pursuit, for those of you who don't know, it's just when somebody runs and then a cop's like, well, I guess I'm going to run after you now. And it doesn't end like it does in the movies. It doesn't end with the old black cop saying, I'm getting too old for this shit, and then tackling the guy. It ends when the much younger person who is not wearing blue polyester and a very heavy belt has outrun the person behind them and then recognizes, I'm not going to outrun radio. Please don't hurt me. Now for the officer, I know you're a bad person because only bad people run. I have a moral certainty. My adrenaline is high because I'm running. Right? And behind every corner could have been someone you put there to hurt me. Right. So you're getting a shot to the kidneys for the price of making me run. Right. They asked us for what specific policies we could do to help change their behaviors in black and brown communities. And our response was, train your officers to slow down. Have them count to 10, or even just the first officer on the scene can't touch the person. You gotta wait for the second officer. The following year, they reduced their use of force across the board, not just foot pursuits, by 23%. Because a race-neutral policy was the solution for a situation that was not race-neutral. You cannot solve the problems in policing if you imagine that the hearts and minds of potentially racist officers are the only problem, right? Structures don't operate that way. They live in our hearts and minds, but structures, they live as structures. And the best way to regulate behavior is to regulate behavior. Tell them that the things they're doing, when the doctor says, it hurts when I go like this, don't do that. That was it, right? Reduce consent searches, and you know what you get? Fewer consent searches. I don't have to teach you to love black people more. That's not a thing to march in the streets for. I can teach you to not pull the trigger, to not show up within a couple feet of Tamir Rice, so that if you think that's a gun, you have no choice but to end the life of a 12-year-old boy. What I'm talking about is the intellectual legacy of a man who dared to challenge ideological canon. Right? At a time when, before social media, these ideas were the wildfire. These were the viral ideas. I can't thank you enough for that, but I can say that we're in dire need of more of it now. So let me leave with this little element. I'm on a panel with two academic giants. I'm glad for this ratio, because it's just 2 to 1 on this side. I'm talking about mass incarceration. Actually, you're with me over here, because you've done front and back. But the reason why the country caught fire for criminal justice reform is because of those videos. It's not just the scholarship. It's not just the fact of mass incarceration, which had begun to bubble up. It's those videos. It's the lived experience. But we have not treated the people in the hidden places within the community with the same kind of attention we've treated the folks in the hidden places in cages. That's not to say that we shouldn't be giving folks in cages all the attention and more. We should. And also, 2017, the federal spigot of funding for any kind of reform is all the way turned off. There's $220 million worth of funding, philanthropic funding, for criminal justice reform across the board. About $220 million in the United States. $200 million goes to decarceration, $10 million to reentry, $10 million to policing. We are funding the pain of these communities as if the pain of incarceration to the pain of policing is a 20 to 1 issue.
Could you say those numbers again?
I will say those numbers again. In 2017, there were about $220 million of philanthropic giving to criminal justice reform. Of that $220 million, $200 million went to decarceration. That's pretrial, restorative justice, bail reform, progressive prosecutors. $200 million to decarceration, $10 million to reentry, $10 million to policing. That's a 20 to 1 ratio. There is no community in the world that feels the pain of incarceration to the pain of policing. That's a 20 to 1 issue. So while we are trying to dig ourselves out of our lack of knowledge of the humanity in the hidden places, we are building, we're digging into a place and we're piling up the dirt on top of other places. So my hope is that as Bill's legacy continues to grow within the criminal justice scholarship space and activist space and policy space, that we take that dirt all the way away, right, and reveal the full humanity from the beginning of that system to the end of it.
What motivated the police in Las Vegas to even open this discussion? And why do you think that after that motivation will continue, given the kind of structural issues that we've been talking about?
So I am in the strange position of being a black man whose job it is to tell people how racist they are. Again, if you get the opportunity, it's a great gig. But it turns out that, I grew up in Philadelphia, in suburban Philadelphia. I did not imagine that my career was going to look like a bunch of police chiefs wanting me to help them with their problems of racism. And sometimes, very occasionally, it turns out I'm just wrong. Most police chiefs in major cities, they haven't just lived through Ferguson. They lived through Rodney King. And many of them lived through Watts. And before that, through Tulsa. Every 20 years, we do this in America, right? Like clockwork. And then there's a presidential commission with people writing stuff down with a whole bunch of recommendations that look a whole heck of a lot alike. Ever read the Kerner Commission? Right? If you haven't, go ahead and skip it. Just read the most recent one. Or if you haven't, wait 15 years, because we're going to do it again. And if you want to do your job rather than just keep your job as a police chief, you get tired. So Vegas is a strange system. They have a sheriff, but it's a police department. So the sheriff who's elected is like, I'm not running again. And we're definitely getting sued. And I don't want my legacy to be a consent decree from the Department of Justice. So I think we might have a problem. Tell me the honest answer. And don't put it out on Front Street. Let me fix it before I'm held accountable to it. And that simple insight of let them fix it before they're held accountable to it is what has resulted in us having the largest collection of police behavioral data in the world. It really wasn't hard. They beat down the door for it. We got 250 departments asking for analyses now that we don't have capacity to do. They want to make the problem better. Many of them don't think the problem is bigotry. I don't care. They'd like to have a tool that lets them say, these are the wrong officers, these are the wrong communities, these are the wrong statutes and policies. So that at the very least, the headache of racism, which is what it is for them, can stop bothering them every 20 years.
Reaction?
Two quick thoughts. Trying to weave these threads together, I think. The way communities have evolved and the way policing has evolved, I think I don't want to say I think we'd all acknowledge this, but I think police are often placed in the difficult situation of having to deal with a whole array of problems that they're woefully unequipped to deal with. Police should not be frontline responders to drug overdose. Police should not be frontline responders to people in mental health crisis. Police should not be frontline responders to all the social fallout of the very harsh conditions of American poverty. Why should they not be the frontline responders? Because basically they've only got one tool, which is to arrest someone. And criminal justice, at its core, is a blaming institution. The police are the tip of the spear in that operation. And if the underlying problems are deeply connected to racial inequality and poverty, which they are, as knowing the communities in which the footprint of the system is heaviest. Police are not the agency that should be dealing with these problems. So I think there's some sort of synthesis here, right, in rethinking what the role of police should be, what the limits of the police role should be, and what other frontline responders might be. The second thing I think of, we've touched on the problem of community violence in different ways, but this discussion and Khalil and Phil in particular put on the absolute front burner that state violence is a massive problem in disadvantaged communities, and we should make no mistake that incarceration is state violence. Policing is state violence, and it's an enormous source of harm. And there are two thoughts I have to weave the threads together.
Khalil, this is an approach that is so different from yours. I mean, this is an ahistorical, sort of ahistorical, pragmatic. I'm reminded of David Kennedy, who also works at John Jay, who determined that the cure for gang violence was to map the situations in which adolescents are likely to bounce into one another. In other words, all of the trivial kinds of issues that produced violence, which was very interesting and covered a moment in history and not anything deeper than that. And required sort of constant intervention to do that mapping, but didn't get at, we used to say, the underlying circumstances. So, I mean, is what Phil talking about inconsistent or consonant with your approach? Is it where does it fit?
That's a good question. It does complicate things because I see pragmatism as as a viable solution in any historical moment. My concern about pragmatism from a policy standpoint is that someone will say this is a dumb idea and we shouldn't do it any longer. So there's a kind of historical pattern where certain kinds of reforms are thought through from a pragmatic political lens, and then they're dismantled.
Right.
And so my worry is that, Phil actually already spoke to it, I have documented all of the police reports going back to the first most substantial one, which came out of a Chicago race riot commission. And there are dozens of them before we even come close to the federal consent decrees and the investigations that have exponentially grown the amount of evidence we have simply by documenting unlawful or unconstitutional police contact. And in those earlier statements, what is the most resonant claim is that the problem of police regulating black life and citizenship goes beyond, and this is kind of my response to Bruce from the pragmatic standpoint. I completely agree police should not be mental health officials, and they should not be on the front lines of other kinds of non-criminal activity in the street. But that's not just the problem of the behavior of individuals who are having some issue in the public realm. It is also that police proactively, either on their own behalf or on the behalf of the mostly, and this is where race and class intersect, wealthier, but also disproportionately white citizens of our various communities decide that they want the police to control the behavior and the non-criminal behavior of their neighbors or the presence of suspicious people. This is what Elijah Anderson got to in part by black and white spaces in his remarks yesterday. So if we take seriously that the repeated pattern of these massive conflagrations that are triggered by some instance of police brutality, then we have to take seriously that police are putting themselves, not because they're responding to some crisis, but let me put it differently. The crisis is that they're responding to white people's discomfort with the presence of black people shifting the residential barriers of various communities. And, we don't have to go very far to know what's happening in our own moment. But that's the pattern that goes back 100 years. And so what does it mean then to pragmatically solve for various practices in the present, from de-escalation to slowing down, which there is no disagreement here on that point, but for the fact that we have police unions around the country that are essentially using the argument of pathology and their own propriety to be safe against that pathology, against the very means that Phil is proposing. Now, so the regulatory state could just say, you don't count anymore. You're not going to have collective bargaining agreements that allow you to behave in such ways, and therefore we can move on. Or the regulatory state is going to be subject to a political process that's going to say, well, yes, we're going to play the fear card, right? We're going to play the moral panic card, which brings us full circle back to where we started. So my enlightened historical perspective is to say that it's not optional to discount an understanding of the role of police in regulating citizenship amongst various groups in American society, past and present, full stop. That is not optional. The best way I would argue that makes sense is think of it as a social vaccination. Right? It may not guarantee that illness does not prevail at some point, but we know, medically speaking, or from a public health perspective, that we'll be better equipped to handle a contagion or a virus, in this case, policing that is hostile and unnecessarily unlawful, or brutalizing or violent to people who don't deserve it. And so that's, to me, where the historical and the pragmatic come into place. It can no longer be something that people choose to be optional. They start with that, and Phil's a perfect example. Phil is deploying history to inform. Now, he may not use it as in his rhetorical toolkit, as he obviously has one that is very deep and wide. But the degree to which he's in a conversation with a police chief, he may not start with slave patrollers, right?
No.
But he knows that that's an option. And he has a full repertoire of possibilities to engage folks when they're ready for that. And to me, if we want to be an enlightened community of public servants, which is the mantra of this school and other schools that claim to want to do that work, ignorance cannot prevail simply because the book's too long or the story's too complicated.
You agree?
I do. I mean, part of this is you framed it as an opposite approach, and I think, Khalil, I will take liberties with your language that they're complementary. On a pragmatic side, we have a series of events coming up where we're trying to entice Khalil to come and speak to chiefs and other folks about history as the first part of an immersive experience. So we use history. But I want to complicate it just a little bit because it's very difficult to tell the history of a people who are rendered invisible. Part of the triage that we do, which is how we think about it, is triaging the patient being the vulnerable communities. Part of the triage actually is a tool for telling the story because the data didn't exist. I tell you, I found out in 2008 that there were no national data on police behavior. And it took me 13 and a half hours to realize that the data just didn't exist. I got up from my desk, went home, I took a nap. Because, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, I guess. So there needs to be an interweaving between root cause and pragmatism on these issues because we've not told them for so long that we don't have the raw materials for some portions of the history.
I think we should take questions? Yes.
Yeah.
Go to the
So I'm afraid I have another class which I'll have to leave for 12 o'clock. So thanks for these comments, which I enjoyed very much, especially Khalil's very kind comments. I want to say first how happy and thankful I am that Bruce and other members of the scholarly community studying the problems of incarceration has finally shifted towards looking at violence and its sources and so on. I appreciate that. I want to suggest, however, that one way to partly control the issue of race, which several of you have sort of discussed here, is, again, to move to the comparative. And there's just wonderful cases. You don't have to go very far. The Caribbean. Now, I come from one of the most violent societies in the world. In fact, for several years, it ranked #1 in violence measured by the rate of homicide in the world. This is a black society. For years, it's been going on since the 60s. We've had many different policies applied to it. So from the conservative, neoliberal, to the very radical. For 8 years, as special advisor to Michael Manley, arguably the most radical, or second most radical prime minister. So you have here a sort of wonderful sort of field because there's tremendous variation between Jamaica, the most violent society in the world, or one of, to Barbados, which is a crime rate which is one of the lowest, to Puerto Rico, and so on. So it's a wonderful field you have here of looking at it in which you can begin to control race and begin to see how class matters. And also the issue of policing. The Jamaican police is notoriously violent, far more violent than any police in America. Why are black people doing this to black people? So, you'll get sort of just a rich field of comparative data, which will directly inform your work here. On the issue of history, look, the simple thing about America is that it is the only advanced majority white society which was once a slave society. This is not true of Canada. It's not true of any of the European countries, even though they were the ones who started these slave societies. And that slavery was violence, and the neo-slavery of Jim Crow. So this society was born in violence, and it is very much part and parcel of the DNA of the society. You have to consider that the violence that for 250 years was slavery. The violence that for another century was Jim Crow. And the way in which this becomes, in a sense, part of the culture of violence in the society. You cannot neglect the facts. And again, going back to Jamaica, the problem of a culture of violence emerging after a long situation of the structural forces, not to neglect the structural forces, but what we've discovered in Jamaica is even when you've changed the policies, even when you have a radical government doing everything possible to change it, you still find, as we find now, the violence sort of persisting in these societies. So I think you'll be well informed, all of you who work in the problem of police violence and of incarceration and crime and punishment, to look at these black societies in the Caribbean and also in Latin America, especially Brazil, on which there is a lot of data. There's tons of data on Jamaica, for example. So please broaden your comparative scope and read the history to understand how, after 400 years of violence, the system has become, if you like, institutionalized in attitudes, in whiteness. When Dubois spoke of the psychological wages of whiteness, part of that being, in fact, just exactly what Khalil referred to, and how this translates into my whiteness, in fact, gives me the privilege, in fact, to police blacks. And one way of policing them is to put them in prison. Another way is to lynch them. Another way is to enact the kind of policies which goes against them. Okay, please. So thanks, Khalil. And I'm afraid I have to leave, guys, because I have a workshop. Well, thank you.
Yes, I'm particularly interested in this definition of crime. I am from Washington, D.C., where now that marijuana is legal, we find the people who are in the top 1% who are leading these marijuana companies, when we see blacks incarcerated and remaining there, having their property taken, everything, because they sold marijuana and probably needed to sell it in order to survive. So for me, that's been a huge question that has really, boggled my mind, is how this society so quickly went from criminalizing the sale of marijuana to now embracing it, to the point of having top ex-politicians in D.C. run these companies. So I'm just interested in hearing what you say.
Let me try that for a moment, since that was sort of my currency. There's an issue about what to do going forward, and then there is a version of the reparations Marshall Plan issue about what to do with the damage we have already done. And your question really goes to the damage we have already done. All of the policies are talking about going forward, but, for example, the men that I sentenced and I study were caught in a pincer between crack cocaine on the one hand and the overreaction to it. And marijuana is the same way. So that's really a compensation, reparations discussion, as opposed to what we do going forward. Take someone at this side.
Yes. In some of the reporting after the de-incarceration bill, I have heard some reporters say that the same people who ran the for-profit prisons have all geared up to serve this population once they're out of prison. And I think that has ominous meanings if it's true, and it certainly isn't a structural answer to the issue. And I wondered what your information is on that. Who, if anyone, is gearing up to serve this population? And is it the same people who were getting money from the private prisons?
Khalil?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting, really important issue, and it connects to the earlier panel actually, and and I think first step will encourage private vendors, particularly on the community side of criminal justice policy, but it's the latest chapter in a long-running trend to growing privatisation of criminal justice and the privatisation of the costs. And the connection to the earlier panel is that this is happening in a context in which anti-tax sentiment really playing out at the state level. Taxes are being reduced by the states. Court services are not funded. Prosecution services are not funded. Community corrections are not funded. So who's paying for this? It's a really expensive system. All of the cost is being transferred to people who are under the control of the system itself. And we see a massive proliferation of fines and fees that are also accompanying a process of privatisation. We have a field study in Oklahoma City now, and we've been in a misdemeanor court in Oklahoma City. All the people going through misdemeanor court, there's a lot of low-level drug offences, a lot of drug possession charges. All the people going through misdemeanor court in Oklahoma City are very, very poor, and people are struggling with a lot of homelessness, a lot of untreated mental illness, and untreated substance use disorders. The cost of a misdemeanor case in Oklahoma City is about $800. You've got to pay the prosecutor $400 to prosecute you, and you have to pay the court $400, which covers the cost of your indigent defence. And then the prosecutor runs community corrections, which is a very unusual situation. And there's a private probation service that you have to pay another $900 for. And the people passing through these courts are basically on zero income. And the safety net, such as it is in a very red state like Oklahoma, has been totally gutted. People can't pay. They get warrants, and they're at risk of reincarceration.
You affirmed my bleak perspective on this.
Whoops. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, well. Anyway, can you hear me? Yep. Yeah, I very much appreciate this panel, and I want to just go back to a point that Khalil made about why is America so punitive? I think that's very important here. And before Orlando left, I just exchanged a couple of words with him about his work, the slavery and social death. I think the historical is very important. Slavery established the black body at the bottom of the order. And as black people moved north to cities and towns north and south, they were ghettoized. Doug Massey knows this well. And, of course, that gave rise to this iconic ghetto. That's a whole set of issues, negative issues that people have to deal with all the time. In other words, the iconic ghetto reinforced what slavery established. And that positionality of white over black, as Jordan points out, has been institutionalized and passed on from generation to generation to generation until we're living it today. And this is just a very important consideration because the police, this is the manifestation of white supremacy in some ways. The slave patrols, you go back to that. And so when you see these videos of these kids on social media being slammed down to the ground by the police for jaywalking or whatever it is, there's tremendous anger there. put these black people back in their place. And this is pervasive, you see. I just think this is very important to think about with respect to incarceration, policing, state violence, all of that. And I just very much appreciate the panel, and these are big issues that we have to grapple with going forward. Thank you.
I'm told that was supposed to be the last question, but I think you should. You've got the last question. Sorry. The first and the last question.
So, Phil, you have a lot of data. And I remember David Simon. It's not?
No, just push the button.
Which button?
I don't know where the button is.
Give him this one.
Okay.
Sorry, Nancy.
Oh, no, that's it. You go.
Make sure this baby is on.